On the night of April 19, 1989, New York City was deep in one of the most violent chapters of its modern history, and Central Park had already gained a reputation for being unpredictable after dark. And at around 9 p.m. that evening, a 28-year-old investment banker named Trisha Meili left her apartment on the Upper East Side for her regular nighttime run, taking a route she had used many times before, unaware that within the next hour she would become the center of a case that would dominate headlines for years and reshape how millions of New Yorkers viewed the park itself. Earlier that same evening, groups of teenagers had entered Central Park from multiple access points, and police would later estimate that between 20 and 30 teens were involved in various incidents throughout the northern end of the park, including harassment, assaults, and robberies unrelated to Meili's route. And as the night went on, these scattered events created confusion for detectives who later had to reconstruct what happened and who was responsible for each separate act. Sometime between approximately 9 and 10 p.m., Meili was attacked, beaten, and SA'd, suffering extreme physical injuries that included skull fractures, hypothermia from exposure, severe blood loss, and trauma consistent with a prolonged assault. And after the attack, she was left unconscious in a remote wooded area near the 102nd Street crossing, a part of the park with little lighting and almost no nighttime foot traffic, and she remained undiscovered for several hours while lying severely injured in the dirt and brush. At roughly 1:30 a.m., police responding to other incidents in the park located her body in a shallow ravine north of the 102nd Street area, and once officers realized that she was still alive, they immediately called for medics, who transported her to Metropolitan Hospital Center, where doctors worked through the early morning hours to stabilize her, transfuse blood, and address injuries so extensive that her survival was initially considered unlikely, with hospital officials telling reporters the next day that her condition was critical and that the next 24 hours would determine whether she lived. By sunrise on April 20th, the story had already become a citywide emergency, and media outlets reported that a female jogger had been brutally beaten and assaulted in Central Park. And because the attack occurred during a period of heightened fear about crime, the incident quickly became symbolic of the city's growing sense of insecurity, with television crews broadcasting from the park's perimeter and newspapers publishing headlines that conveyed shock, urgency, and anger. Within hours, detectives began questioning multiple teenagers who had been detained in connection with the earlier incidents in the park, and over the next 2 days, the focus narrowed to 6 teenagers, including Yusuf Salam, Antron McCrae, Kevin Richardson, Raymond Santana, Corey Wise, and Stephen Lopez, and police conducted lengthy interrogations during which several of the boys gave statements that prosecutors later described as confessions, even though the accounts were inconsistent, conflicting, and often contradicted established timelines and forensic findings. As the media seized on the narrative that a group of boys had attacked the jogger as part of the larger disturbances in the park that night, 4 of the teens, Richardson, McCrae, Salam, and Santana, were charged as juveniles, while Wise, who was 16, was charged as an adult. And although Stephen Lopez was initially charged in connection with the jogger case, prosecutors later dropped those charges and pursued him only on a separate robbery charge unrelated to the assault. While the investigation moved forward, Meili was still unconscious in the hospital, and doctors later reported that she remained in a coma for approximately 12 days, eventually regaining consciousness on May 1, 1989, but with no memory of the assault, no recollection of entering the park, and no ability to identify anyone involved in the attack, meaning the case depended entirely on the physical evidence and the statements obtained by detectives. During the trials that followed in 1990, prosecutors relied heavily on the teenagers' videotape statements, despite the fact that the confessions contradicted one another in key details, placed the boys in different locations at different times, and did not match the forensic evidence, including the fact that DNA recovered from the scene did not match any of the defendants. And although defense attorneys challenged the interrogation methods and the reliability of the statements, the boys were convicted. Richardson, McCrae, Salam, and Santana were each sentenced to 5 to 10 years in juvenile facilities, serving between 5 and 7 years before their release, while Corey Wise, tried as an adult, was sentenced to 5 to 15 years, serving approximately 11 and a half years in adult prisons before he was released. And throughout this period, the public perception of the case remained shaped by the original headlines, which painted the park as a dangerous place overtaken by youth violence. For months following the attack, Central Park saw a noticeable drop in nighttime visitors, with joggers avoiding the bridle paths and wooded areas after dark, parents instructing their teenagers not to go near the park in the evenings, and tourist guides warning travelers to stay on well-lit paths or avoid the park altogether after sunset. And while the NYPD increased patrols, the psychological effect of the attack lingered across the city, reinforcing an already growing fear during a decade marked by high crime and public anxiety. More than a decade later, in 2002, the case underwent a dramatic shift when Matias Reyes, a convicted murderer and serial offender already serving a life sentence, confessed that he alone had assaulted Meili. And when investigators tested his DNA, it matched the DNA found at the scene, providing direct forensic confirmation that he had been the sole attacker, and he offered details about the assault that aligned precisely with the physical evidence and the nature of Meili's injuries. After a full review by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, prosecutors concluded that the teenager's confessions were unreliable. The forensic evidence pointed only to Reyes, and the convictions had rested on flawed investigative methods and public pressure rather than concrete proof. And on December 19, 2002, the convictions of all 5 men were vacated, officially clearing them of the charges related to the attack. For Meili, the aftermath included years of physical recovery, therapy, and rehabilitation, and when she eventually revealed her identity publicly in 2003, she spoke about her recovery and the people who helped her survive, while acknowledging that she still had no memory of the attack itself, leaving the details known only through forensic records, Reyes's confession, and the investigative files that ultimately corrected the outcome of the case. The Central Park jogger case remains one of the most consequential crimes in New York City's history because of how it transformed public perception of Central Park, intensified debates about policing and crime, produced wrongful convictions that lasted more than a decade, and reflected the wider anxieties of a city struggling with violence during the late 1980s. And for months after the attack, the park's reputation was so damaged that many New Yorkers treated it as a place to avoid at night, unsure whether the violence of that evening was a tragic exception or a warning about what the city had become, resulting in wrongful convictions for 5 teenagers, and was finally resolved when the real perpetrator confessed, reshaping how New York remembers one of its most high-profile crimes of the era.